Well, I write what I call spoken word, which is poetry specifically written so that the first time it's ever experienced, it's going to be heard before it's read. I hope, with any luck, my poems stand up on the page as well. But I'm a spoken word poet, so what I think about when I'm writing them is, how am I going to recite this? What is my voice going to do? How am I going to pause? Am I going to sing this line? Am I going to break into Maroon 5 for 10 seconds right here? What will my hands do? And it tends to make your poetry more immediately accessible. If you finish a poem and there's nothing in it that you understand, your eyes are going to glaze over. The poet who writes for the page and the poet who writes for the stage both have similar tools in their toolboxes, but the poet who is writing for the page knows that if a reader does not understand everything in her poem, they have the luxury of reading it again, or going slowly, or looking a word up in the dictionary. In my poem, if the reader doesn't understand anything, because I'm writing for the stage, they don't have the luxury of reading it again. In fact, they don't even have the luxury of reading it at all, unless they buy my book afterwards. They're going to hear it the first time. So I'm not saying I have to write to the dumbest, lowest common denominator, but there has to be something in it for everybody. It has to be, which tends to make it funny, sensationalistic, verbal. As I said, singing. You can break into Maroon 5 and sing for 10 seconds. And so I went to drama school, and I found that the poetry slam was the ideal way for me to marry my talents together. Some poems are spoken first. What I used to do is I would write the poem on my computer, print it out, and then I would videotape myself holding the camera, reading the poem, reading what I had, and then when I got to the end, I would sort of freestyle and just go on and make it up. Then I would stop, rewind, look at what I'd watched the whole performance, edit from the performance, and then when I got to the new part and thought, oh, that's good, and then I would tweak it and say, oh, but what if I went there? And then I would do that again. It's a dance. Since I'm a spoken word poet, no poem can be complete until I've read it out loud in front of an audience and seen where I got the reaction I wanted, seen where I didn't get the reaction I wanted, and tested whether or not that was okay. There are some a poet who writes for the page often would be insulted if you suggested that she change a line based on the reaction she did or didn't get. Many traditional academic poets, nobody likes that term, but that's what I mean, instead of saying normal poets, okay, normal poets, many normal poets who don't write to be heard out loud, although nobody would say that. All poets say, oh, I write for the voice. Really? Then why are you such a terrible reader? Where am I going with this? Most poets who write for the page believe that the text of the poem, after they are done with it, the text is sacrosanct, and that no reaction they did or did not get from a bunch of drunk, racist homophobes is going to make them change their words. Billy Collins, who's the former U.S. Poet Laureate, one of my favorite poets, and a good friend of mine, I once asked him, how do you prepare for your readings? And he said, I don't. One reading is preparation for the next, because the poem exists here on the page, and how I read it on any given night is almost incidental. And a spoken word poet would say the opposite. No, the poem exists here in the moment that I'm speaking it, and how it looks on the page is almost incidental. Which is why so many slam poets, when you buy their books, it doesn't really work as well, on paper. With any luck, I'm the exception that proves the rule. Certainly there are poems that I tend to do. There are poems that I tend to be asked to do that I would rather not do. It's my jumping jack flash, if you will. I have told people I will probably die reciting What Teachers Make. Some of my friends have said that if they hear me recite it again, I might die sooner than I thought, that they will actually murder me. The poem's been seen 4 million times on YouTube. Many of my friends feel like they've had to sit through a couple of million of those times. If there are readings in New York City where if I launched into, he says the problem with teachers, people would go, no, for love of God, do not make me have to hear that poem again. Sometimes I feel like that. But you know what? The only thing worse than having one poem that you're known for and that people request every time you read over the course of a 50-year performance poetry career is having no poems that anybody wants you to read. One of the worst kinds of silence there is the silence that happens at a reading when you go, okay, I'll do a few more poems. Are there any requests? No? Well, maybe I'll end early. If you ask for requests and everybody's sitting there going, I've got a request, end now, be done. As a result of poems like What Teachers Make and other sort of anthemic poems that celebrate the art of teaching, I began to get people writing to me and saying, because of the way you talk about the teaching profession, I've decided to become a teacher. Either you're responsible in some small part for my decision. So I began to keep track, and after about 10 people had told me that they were going to become teachers, I thought that I should give myself a goal. So I said, I'm going to give myself 6 years to push 1,000 people into the teaching profession. So I'm up to 820, but I know for a fact that there are 20 teachers left in the queue. So I should reach 1,000 teachers at some point next year, right about the time that I got a book coming out next spring called What Teachers Make, which is a book of essays on teaching, part memoir and part essays on teaching philosophy. So right about then. So I don't know what the next task will be, and to some extent, it'll be great not to be constantly worrying about, people can write to me and say, hey, because of you I decided to become a teacher, and I won't have to write back and go, really? Are you on my list? But that said, I have reserved the domain names 10,000teachers.com. I love to quote the Latin poet Horace, who wrote over 2,000 years ago that the task of the poet is to either delight or instruct, and that we must reserve our greatest approbation for those who can do both at the same time. So when I'm writing, I try to do both. I try to be both delightful and I try to be instructive. But if I can only do one, personally, I will err more towards the side of delight than instruction. However, all the best teachers know that those two qualities are also important in the classroom. To delight or entertain, to entertain and instruct. There are so many things out there that demand the student's attention. I'm not one of those teachers who believes that learning is supposed to be fun. It's not always fun. Life is filled with stuff you've got to do, even though you don't want to do it. But where it can be made fun, do everybody a favor and do so. When you have stood your ground in front of 27th graders, the worst of all ages, then no other crowd can scare you. But there are many types of teachers, but there are those who dazzle from the front of the classroom and those who are more comfortable coaching from the back of the classroom. I'm your coach, and I'm going to whisper in your ear, and you can do better, you can do better. So I was certainly the former. Watch me in the front. I'm the big hand. So to go from there to the stage was a very small step. But I see what you're saying. Yeah, you are on stage when you're in front of the class, when you're giving a lecture. But I never felt self-conscious. I was the center of attention. I prefer it that way. The more I study education and the process, how the brain works, the more I realize that it's all about pre-primary education. That if we want to fix education in America, it's getting more kids in school at age 3. Before kindergarten can't be the first time. And the studies indicate, apparently I found out this morning, that Colorado judges how many prisons they're going to need in the future by how well the current 3rd grade is doing on tests, with remarkable accuracy. If they get a really bad crop of 3rd graders, they start building new prisons, and suddenly, I mean, to a certain extent, it's probably a self-fulfilling prophecy, but we should look at that and improve the quality of education before 3rd grade, not improve the facilities for imprisoning them when they leave 3rd grade. So I'm very active on the local level, and last year I competed in the individual World Poetry Slam Championships, and I was 17th in the world. Woohoo! So
in multiple languages?
No, it's all in English. Although the first time we had the World Poetry Slam Championships, there's a poet in Seattle named Buddy Wakefield who's beloved, and he toured constantly for 10 years. And I think he still calls Seattle home, but he won the first individual World Poetry Slam Championships. The Poetry Slam is still very important to me, even if I don't actively compete in it. I still believe in the art form. Basically, the question is, what makes that a poem? And I get people coming up to me after my reading saying, I hate poetry, and yet I like what you do. So either you've broadened my idea of what poetry is, or else what you do is not poetry, which is sort of more convenient for them. They don't have to change their idea. They don't have to redefine what poetry is for them. It's easier, like, you must not do poetry, because I like what you do, but I know that I don't like poetry. And that's Jack McCarthy in Slam Nation, who says, you have to do one poem that everybody agrees is a poem. And after that, if you say it's a poem, it's a poem. Listen, if you Google what is poetry, you will get thousands of definitions that span thousands of years of people trying to explain what is and what is not poetry. And nobody's right. There's no monolithic definition of what is poetry. You can divide the definitions up into certain camps, those who think it's about making the familiar seem new and the new seem familiar, those who think it's cathartic, those who think it's purely playful, those who think it's a musicality brought into language. And what is true is Samuel Johnson said, if you try to circumscribe poetry with a definition, you will only show the narrowness of the definer. So if you try to say what poetry is, you're going to end up saying more about who you are than what poetry is. So I love debating what is and what is not poetry, but you would have to give me a beer.